Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and everyone from all over the world. I am back with Odon LaFontaine. As you know, he is the author of The Great Secret of Islam. If you want to know more about his work, that's what you search for on Google to find his book, available as a free PDF. And it's a fascinating thesis that really makes sense of the Islamic narrative from a historical and I would say a scientific, logical, critical perspective. And also, thank you all of you who've waited. I mistakenly set the broadcast time for like 5 to 1 Warsaw time. That's when we confirmed and set up the broadcast. So obviously, my bad, my mistake. But you guys know I'm pretty good at this YouTube stuff. That's still getting it wrong. But anyway, I fixed it. Thanks for the heads up someone gave me about fixing it. And we're back. And thanks all for supporting the channel. Thank you for the chat, for the comments. And good to see you all. And welcome back, Odon, for part 2 of this book.
Hello, Lloyd. Hello everyone. And yeah, it's good to be back. Thank you for having me. And we are to follow up on the previous presentation. It's becoming a whole series. It's our presentation about the Jews and the Nazarenes in the Quran, but it has connections with the one we did previously, especially the one on the fabrication of the Islamic narrative. And so tonight, I hope we will be able to finish, to wrap up the Jews and Nazarene in the Quran presentation. And I've got some, how can I put it, some hot stuff for everyone, for you, for the audience.
Yeah. You know, also, I'm finding this also overlaps with what I was doing, obviously, on the Mushrikun. There's parallels there as well. But it raises questions, but not in the sense that it just leaves you more puzzled. It starts to raise logical questions. I think it starts to categorize things. It starts to make logical distinctions between things. It posits scenarios. From there, you can develop scenarios and assess their likelihoods. You can see how things interconnect, and you can start to dismiss certain scenarios and start to see that certain things have evidence and credibility. So I think it's actually helping to refine the view, to bring it into better focus.
That's the thing with the Quranic studies. When you look at the literal Quranic text, you tread on an almost solid ground. And the thing with early Islam is we don't have much evidence. We have very little in terms of evidence and solid ground. We have a few archaeological remains, we have coins, we have a few sources, but not that much. We have the huge Islamic tradition, but it's very late, and it's got a lot of biases. Whereas with the Quran, with the Quranic text, we have something that is almost a primary source for the events of early Islam, and it hasn't been investigated much.
Question, hold on what you're saying. Why is the Quran so vague? Is that deliberate? Did they remove a lot of things, or were they just writing down a lot of hearsay, badly written, paraphrased information?
First of all, it was never written as a book. That has to do with the editing process of the Quran and the material out of which it came. According to my hypothesis, my researches that I built on the research of Edouard Marie-Gallès, the Quran, it's a whole presentation in itself, but I will try to make it very short. The Quran has been compiled and edited out of notes that were written by Arab preachers. Those notes were preparation notes for future preaching. There were sometimes verbatim notes that were taken during live preaching sessions, and mostly some of them were also instruction notes that the preacher took when they were listening to their instructors. So they had masters, religious masters, who taught them what to preach. And this became a sort of bulk of notes, which explains why the raw material of the Quran is so defective. It's
Mm-hmm.
written in a defective alphabet, whereas we know that in the 7th century there already existed diacritic marks and so on. So it was voluntarily written in a defective alphabet, as a student does when he takes notes. You see, it tries to make it fast. And besides, if you look at the Islamic tradition, it was also written, the very early material, it was written on makeshift support, like camel bones or palm leaves or pottery shards. Those are the supports for notes, not for a religious revelation.
Question on that. I mean, all fair points, and I agree. However, I mean, you have often said, look, this Quranic narrative is fabricated, and that was invented for
Mhm, mhm.
whatever reasons. So specifically to the point of the camel bones and leaves and eggshells and whatnot,
Eggshells.
the Islamic empire at that point was wealthy. I mean, from caravan robbing, piracy, slavery, all that stuff was quite lucrative. You would
Mhm.
think that unlike the Christians, who were very, very poor and didn't have any kind of political power for centuries, the Muslims had money. They could have afforded the best writing implements, the best writing surfaces like vellum. And Muhammad had something like, what, 20 odd scribes. You'd think that they had a bit of money to throw around for really quality writing materials and to write things in a way that's better than eggshells and old cabbage leaves.
Think of these early writings as being only notes. It was not about a religious book at the time. There were only notes that some of them were taken on the fly. It was not that important. But what happened afterwards is that these notes were collected by Arab leaders, and they were the only material, the only Arabic material they had. The other religious texts were in Aramaic or in Hebrew, maybe, but the only Arabic religious text they had was these notes, were these notes.
Mm-hmm.
So when they wanted to make an Arabic religious book, they were sort of stuck with these notes, and they had to make do with what they were. So poor material, badly written for some of it, not all of it is badly written, but at least it was in Arabic. And so they selected folios and some notes. There was a selection process. The notes were copied on parchment, copied and recopied, and there was an editing process. It was the compiling of the Quran. Some notes were chosen, others were not, and were destroyed. And the editors compiled everything. They mixed the various notes, and they ultimately, at the time of Abdul Malik or immediately thereafter, the Quran emerged as a book. But you see, at the beginning, it was not a book. It was never. It was not a it. It was
So
a collection of tens, maybe hundreds of makeshift supports with notes.
So when they needed to create a common narrative because the empire was growing and needed a common narrative to form around, this was something that was uniquely Arabic, which might explain why they say you have an Arabic Quran. So this was a
Mhm.
uniquely Arabic corpus that they could create their new religion out of.
That's the thing with Islam. You see, the caliphs. who compiled the Quran and so on. So starting with Abdul Malik, in my opinion, and after him, they could not create their religion from scratch. There was already a religious movement, a messianic movement. At the beginning, it was centered on Jesus, I think, and the coming of his second coming as the Messiah. And the movement evolved, and they had to make do with the existence of the religious feelings of the Arabs and what had already been done. You see, it would have been much more easier for them to create their religion almost from scratch, to write a book, a bit like Joseph Smith did with the Mormon movement. He wrote his book from scratch, and it was much more easy for him to convince his audience that it was a new revelation than it was for the caliphs with the Quran, because his book was made with the purpose of creating a religion. Whereas with the Quran, it was much more difficult because the notes were taken at a time when Islam did not exist yet. It was the pre-Islamic movement, the proto-Islamic movement. And they were stuck with it. Because in the past, before Abdul Malik, the notes had already been, there were already compilation process a bit, and it had gained some importance, and it could not be sidelined like this. And it was the only Arabic material they had. So as they were sort of constrained, forced to do with this material. So that's my answer about the Quran. I have several presentations, and you can see on my website a presentation about the making process of the Quran. In my book and also on the website, I have put up a comic strip synthesizing the process, because it's a bit complex, and it's much more easy to understand with a comic strip. And there are videos also on my channel and the channel of friends who invited me to explain it. This this answers a question I wanted to ask as a conclusion to this very presentation, which I'm about to start. But it's a very interesting question. But the thing that is a bit difficult with when dealing with early Islam, it's difficult to focus on a single issue, a single topic. It's difficult to focus on Muhammad only, or the Quran only, or the Nazarenes only, because you only get to understand how Islam came together and emerged when you look at everything and when you have everything in mind. So you have to look at the Quran, the Jews, the Nazarenes, the Quran, but you also have to look at the Quranic studies and the ancient manuscript studies that tell us about the making process of the Quran, for example, and all the numerous fields of research. But here we are doing a presentation only on the Nazarenes. But even with this presentation, it has ties, connections with many other studies, historical studies, archaeological studies, Quranic studies, and so on. But the thing I do want to focus on now is the study of the literal text of the Quran, especially the text the text about the Jews and the Nazarenes in the Quran. So Lloyd, if you're okay, I can start the presentation. Let me share my screen. All right, and all right. Do you see the presentation, Lloyd?
There it is.
Yeah, it seems to work. All right. And my camera is working also. No, it's frozen. No, no. Okay, no, it's working. It's working.
Fine.
So,
Right now.
we already saw about in the previous presentation what the Quran has to say about Jews. The most important discovery we made is that the Quran distinguishes between two groups of Jews: the good Jews and the bad Jews. And mostly the Quran says the Jews are bad. There is only a tiny fraction, a tiny group within the Jews that behaves properly, that has a good faith. They are the good Jews. And it's a sort of leitmotif in the Quran. It's very important for the authors of the Quran at the time. It was very important for them to distinguish and to pinpoint a good community among the Jews. So let me go. This was the former presentation, which is to be seen on your channel, Lloyd, distinguishing good Jews from bad Jews. And we came to the conclusion about bad Jews that the way the Islamic narrative portrays the protagonist of Islam as is described in this diagram is completely wrong. It's completely incoherent with the literal reading of the Quran. So there is no such things actually, if you look at the literal text of the Quran, as the people of the book as being Muslims plus Christians plus Jews, or mushrikun being pagans. It doesn't work like this. Instead, we found that the people of the book are Jews and that they are composed of an upstanding community among the people of the book, the good Jews, and other bad Jews that we identified as being the rabbinic Jews, or at least the coverers, from the Arabic root kfr, meaning to cover.
Mm-hmm.
So in the first meaning, the first sense of the word, it means to cover the sacred scriptures with something else, other man-made scriptures or interpretations. In
Do you think that could be a
derived,
reference to the Talmud? Did you think that that could be a direct
no,
reference to the Talmud?
I think it's a direct reference to the Talmud. If we look at the various religious, the various Jewish groups, who were the majority, who had written man-made scriptures. I think it refers to the rabbinic Jews. There were other small communities within within Judaism, very small communities, but they did not have they did not fit the Quran's descriptions. They do not amount for most of the Jews as the Quran describes. Most of the Jews in the 7th century belong to the Talmudic communities. The Quran also speaks of very small Jewish communities. It speaks a bit about Samaritans, for example. It speaks about Sabaean, but we don't know exactly whether they were Jewish or not.
Yeah, but the Sabaeans were, I mean, there's references to Abraham being a Sabaean, but then we have to distinguish because the Quran confuses between Sabians and Sabaeans. There's a difference.
Yeah, maybe.
So the Sabaeans are sort of a sort of pagan Gnostic sect, Turkey, Haran area, Turkey, Syria border, whereas the Sabians are Yemeni pagans. These are outright pagans, moon worshippers. And in the Quran, Muhammad is a Sabi, and we don't know, but it leans towards him being a Sabian, which would, and the Sabians are said to be people of the book. Now these are Gnostics. So I've had a long look at this in the recent past, and it's so there is some confusion there because there seems to be overlap between.
I
It seems to
agree.
randomly sometimes select between Sabians and Sabaeans, and it conflates them as one in many cases.
I agree. But the thing is, we we are engaged in a literal reading of the Quran. So we rely on the Quran. We make the sort of hypothesis that the Quran, it's not a hypothesis. What I am doing right now is explaining what the Quran literally says, and only this. And the Quran talks about this distinction between good Jews and bad Jews, telling us the bad Jews are the vast majority, the 99% of the Jews. It describes, a contrario, by contrast, the good Jews, and gives them and describes it with some traits. For example, they are not coverers. They haven't covered the sacred scriptures. They have recognized Jesus as the Messiah. But they are not Christians, since they belong to the people of the book. And we saw earlier that the people of the book, literally in the Quran, are not associators. They cannot be. And they are opposed to Christians. We also saw that this community of the good Jews hold the Torah and the Gospel sacred. Those are their sacred scriptures. And they still have their unaltered text in their possession. And they have the true faith. And they sort of have a relationship with the Arab believers. They know each other, or at least the Arab believers know some of them. It gives us a start to try to understand who the good Jews are. We have something here. It's a start. It's a beginning. Let's look at the description that the standard Islamic narrative makes of the protagonist of early Islam. According to it, we have the Arab believers, the Jews, the pagans, and Nazarenes, who are supposed to be Christians. But when we look at the literal Quranic text, we see that the people of the book are composed of Jews only, distinguishing between good Jews and bad Jews, which led us to the question, what about the Nasara? Who are the Nasara in the text? Are they Christians? Are they actually Christians? What does the Quranic text say about the Nasara? What about the Mushrikun, supposedly pagans? We have a video series ongoing about this topic. And those are very, very important questions. And this led us to investigate the Nazarenes. We started to look at the Nazarenes in the Quran, and this will be the main topic of this presentation. We saw that there are 15 occurrences of the Nasara or Nasrani expression in the Quran. They're supposed to be Christians, but it differs from the actual Arabic word for Christian. Etymologically, a Christian in Arabic, Christians are Masih, people of the Messiah, Al-Masih in Arabic. And Nasara doesn't fit this meaning. Nasara actually is not an Arabic word. It comes directly from, it's not an Arabic word. It comes directly from Aramaic. I'm going fast here because we already saw it, and I want to address the rest of the presentation. We saw that Nasara is a direct transliteration of the Aramaic word Natsaraya, and that Natsaraya is connected with the messianic prophecy of Isaiah. Natsaraya, it's the people of the Netzer being the branch, so the descendants of Jesse or the descendants of David. So Natsaraya had been in the past a descendant of David. So Jesus, for example, as he was a son of David or descendant of David, was a Nazarene, a Nazariah. And by extension, his partisans were also Nazarias. So in the first century, the first Christians were called Nazariah, Nazarenes, because they were partisans of the Messiah. And because they recognized Jesus as such. But
Yeah. To me,
quickly, they adopted. Yeah, Lloyd, you want to
yeah, I just
intervene?
want to add something. Just a quick overview here. This is Da'if Bukhari, Volume 1, Book 7, Hadith 340. And I'm not going to go into much detail, but so they requested her to accompany them. She asked where. They said, to Allah's messenger. She said, do you mean the man who is called the Sabi with a new religion?
Ah.
Now, in Islam, they try to define a Sabi as someone who creates a new religion, right? So you find it within the Islamic narrative, they try to say a Sabi is someone who creates a new religion. Whereas if you look overall between the Hadith literature and so on, and the Sirah and the Quran, the Sabi, as I said, there's a conflation between Sabaeans, Yemeni moon worship, pagans who controlled West Africa, Northwest Africa, Arabia, and so on, which was the same religion as the Mesopotamian moon religion, the same as they had in Baghdad, right? So this is the same as the Babylonian religion, just the Arabized version of it with Arabized names of the gods, but the same religion. And the Sabi are Gnostics, right? These are magicians, Gnostics, occultists, that kind of thing, and pagans. So yeah, those are the Sabi, yeah, the Sabaeans from Sheba, right? Then you've got the Sabi. Now they call Muhammad in more than one location. They call Muhammad a Sabi. Now generally it leans towards the Sabaeans, which is the guys in Haran, Turkey, these Gnostics, whom the Quran refers to as the people of the book. But then in other cases, it's clearly talking about the Sabaeans, the Yemeni moon worshippers, the Babylonian pagans with the Babylonian pantheon, just the Arabic version of it, and or the Arabic names for it. So yeah, you get this. I mean, so within the tradition, there's Muhammad is definitely a Sabi, which makes him a Sabian, which makes him a Gnostic, which is a little weird, an occult pagan Gnostic. It's a weird mixture of these things. So I just wanted to highlight that and just keep that in mind for discussion later or analysis in the future. Just wanted to bring that up. It's an odd set of references, and this is just one of those.
Mm-hmm. You'll see here we will come across occurrences of Sabaeans within the Quranic text, and I don't think it refers to the good Jews that are described in the Quran. But
No, not at all. It's a different group. It's a completely separate group. It's one of these groups that are supposedly people of the book, but it's a completely
it's very
different
clear
group.
in the Quran that the Nazarenes and the Sabaeans are different groups. But let me get to it. Let me just finish. This was the conclusion of the previous presentation. This was the last slide we presented with the question, were there still Jewish Nazariah in the 7th century? And who are the Nasara in the Nasara in the Quran? And this is what we are, this is the topic of the presentation, part 2. So let's start officially the presentation. By looking at the Nazarene in the Quran. So I won't go in detail on every verse, but know that there are 15 occurrences of the Nazarenes or Nazarene in the Quran as Nasara or Nasrani in 14 verses. And when we look at all these verses and their contextual verses also, there are things that emerge about the Nazarenes. First of all, when we do a basic reading, just a basic reading of the literal Quran, we already can know that the Nazarenes are not Christians. If you look at for example, at the verses 65 to 67, Surah 3, there is something about Abraham, who was neither Jewish nor Nazarene. So it tells us that Jews and Nazarenes might be alike, but they are not exactly the same, because there is a need to make a distinction. But moreover, he was not one of the associators. So if the text needs to precise that he was neither Jew nor Nazarene and not one of the associators, it means that the associators are neither Jew, neither Jewish, nor Nazarenes. So it tells us that the Nazarenes are not associators, they are not Christians. In Surah 5, verse 51, it tells us something very strange. We will go back to it in a bit. It says, supposedly God speaking, or the preacher, "O you who believe, do not take the Jews and the Nazarenes for friends. They are friends of each other." But if you look at who the Jews were during the 7th centuries, they were the enemies of the Christians. So the enemy of my friend is my enemy. Therefore, Nazarenes were enemies of the Christians. So they were not Christians. If the text makes sense, it cannot be that the Nazarenes are Christians. Otherwise, they couldn't be friends with the Jews. At the time, let us have in mind that the Jews and the Christians strongly opposed. In 614, there was, during the Persian-Byzantine War, a very important episode, which is the conquest of Jerusalem by the Persians. And the Persians had set up an army composed of Persians, of course, but also of a very strong Jewish force from Babylon, some Arab auxiliaries also. And when they came into Palestine, or the Holy Land, the Jews rose against the Byzantines in all the Levant. They joined the Persians, they took Jerusalem, and there was a Jewish rule over Jerusalem for 3 years, during which the Jews killed tens of thousands of Christians and enslaved many Christians also. And it tells us there was a very strong enmity between Jews and Christians at the time. So it cannot be that the Jews and the Nazarenes or the Christians were friends at the time. So it's very important. Nazarenes were enemies of the Christians. This is what the text tells us. Another verse, Surah 5:82. Certainly, we'll find that the most violent people in enmity to the believers are the Jews and the associators, those who associate. And certainly, we'll find that the closest of them in affection to the believers are those who say, "We are Nazarenes." So here we have also something that tells us that the Nazarenes are different from the associators. The associators are Christians because they associate Jesus with God, according to the Quran. So we have another verse telling us that the Nazarenes are not Christians. And there is this verse 17 in Surah 22. Surely those who believe and those who Judaized or became Jews, and the Sabaeans and the Nazarenes and the Magians and the associators, surely God will decide between them on the day of resurrection. So we have an enumeration with different categories, and the author of the text has the need to differentiate between Nazarenes and associators again, telling us that the Nazarenes are different from those who associate. Excuse me. So Here we have 4 different verses, all converging, telling us that the Nazarenes are not Christians. So it seems rather important. When we look at the other verses about the Nazarenes, it tells us, according to the same very basic reading of the Quran. I'm not contesting the authenticity of the text. I'm just reading the literal Quran here. And it tells that the Nazarenes are part of the people of the book, but they are different from most of the other Jews. This is what the literal text says. We have in the Quran numerous verses with which put the Jews and the Nazarenes together. It's kind of strange because the Jews and the Christians, like I told you before, are supposed to be arch enemies during the 7th century.
Yeah. Can we pause a moment? I want to bring up something as well. Screen. Just easier to. So, in the Sirah, there's a group of Muslims who are searching. They leave Mecca to travel in search of the Hanafiya, or the religion of Abraham. So this is the original religion of Abraham, and they reject that Abraham was a Muslim. Sorry, was a Jew, and they reject that Abraham was a Christian. Both religions are considered false religions, right? So they are looking for the religion of Abraham before he became a Jew, before he worships Yahweh. Now, that religion is the Sabaean religion according to Maimonides. Now, remember, the Quranic narrative leans towards the Sabians, which are these Gnostics. The Sabaeans are this from Yemen, this moon worshipping group. But Maimonides says it is well known that the patriarch Abraham was brought up in the religion and opinion of the Sabaeans. You see, even here they say Sabaeans, right, when they mean Sabians, ignoble remnants of the nations left in remote corners of the earth. And like the savage Turks in the extreme north and the Indians in the extreme south, these are remnant Sabaeans who once filled the earth. So the Sabaeans contend that Seth differed from his father Adam as regards worship of the moon. Anyway, so without getting into this too much, so according to the Islamic narrative, at least in the Sirah, they believe that Abraham was a Sabian, which was a moon worshipping Babylonian, effectively. And so it's just, how does all this factor in? How do we factor this into? I mean, we don't have to answer it now, but I just want to throw this in there as just a point, something to consider. From Jewish.
I can answer this, but I will go a bit ahead of myself. I will address this in the presentation.
Yeah, we don't have to answer this now.
The key here is the expression Jew or Nazarene, or neither Jew nor Nazarene. But let me address this in due time. I promise you, we will address it. But the thing, there is something odd with the repetition, the many occurrences of the Jew or Nazarene, neither Jew nor Nazarene, Jew and Nazarene. You see the juxtaposition of Jew and Nazarene in the text. But let me keep this for later. For now, let's just consider that we have many verses that seem to indicate that Jews and Nazarene have something in common. They are named, referred to in the same verses as being almost similar. You see, for example, the Jew will not be pleased with you, nor the Nazarene, until you follow their religion. So there's supposed to be a common religion between the Jews and the Nazarene. Be a Jew or be a Nazarene, or be Jews or Nazarene, you will be on the right course. Say, no, we follow the religion of Ibrahim, the Hanif, and he was not a Christian. And so on. And the Jew and the Nazarene say, we are the Son of God and his beloved ones. So you see there are many occurrences of verses that put Jews and Nazarenes together, indicating a sort of common religious ground between the Jews and the Nazarenes. There is this verse, for example, verse 113 in Surah 2, that says that the Jews say the Nazarene rely on nothing, the Nazarenes say the Jew relies on nothing, while they recite the book. So this common religious ground, it might be that they have the same book, the same scripture. So the Old Testament or the Tanakh. We have other verses that also put Jews and Nazarenes together. Do you say that Abraham and Ismail and Jacob and the tribe were Jews or Nazarene? Or this one, Ibrahim was not a Jew nor a Nazarene, but he was completely subject to God. This seems to indicate also a common ethnicity. If you look at those two verses, especially verse 140 in Surah 2, the author has a sort of tribal minds. Ibrahim, Ismail, Jacob, they belong to the same family. And it wants to make a distinction with Jews and Nazarenes as being not from the same tribe or the same ethnicity. In my opinion, it sort of referred to the fact that Jews and Nazarene shared a common ethnicity. They were Jews, actually. They were all Jews. But there is something very strange about these Nazarene Jews. Verse 51 in Surah 5 says that, we already saw this verse, Jews and Nazarenes are friends of each other. Which is also another point in the making of a common ground between the Jews and Nazarenes, according to the literal reading of the text, even though I don't agree with the Islamic reading of the text. And there is this last verse, important one, in Surah, again in Surah 5, verse 82. It talks about Nazarenes, talks about them being the closest in affection to the believers because they have priests and monks among them and because they are not arrogant.
Okay.
So they are odd Jews because they have priests and monks. They belong to the people of the book who are supposed to be Jew, but this very particular group of Jews, the Nazarenes, have priests. And we know there are no priests anymore in Judaism since the destruction of Jerusalem's temple. There are no sacrifices, so no need for priests. And there are no monks within Judaism also.
Yeah, so I'm just curious. I want to raise a couple of things just before you go too far. I mean, so Muslims call on people to return to the original religion of Abraham. I mean, that's present within the sources, right? And then, so Indian Christian apologetics says Ibrahim was a Hanif, right, or pillar worshipping pagan. It was his original religion before Yahweh called him and set him apart. Now, to go to this here, let me just take that away. This is Hanif in the Encyclopedia of Islam, right? Plural, Hunafa. In Islamic writings, one who follows the original and true monotheistic religion. In the Quran, Hanif is used especially of Abraham. Later Islamic usage, so later usage, claimed Hanif as the equivalent of Muslim. That came later. So Hanafiya is the religion of Abraham or Islam, supposedly, right? So we now know, okay, Hanif is a Muslim, but that was a later usage. Hanafiya is the religion of Abraham, but we know Abraham was a pagan, a pillar worshipping, rock worshipping, idol worshipping pagan prior to following Yahweh. So he was not a monotheist. Now, one could say technically he was, because you had a pantheon and there was the Allah called Al Makkah, also known as the moon god Shin. And then you had the lesser pantheon, but who were not the single god, but fine. I mean, so that you can use a very twisted definition of monotheism there by saying there is a single created deity, and then you've got 360 idols of other deities, for argument's sake.
Okay.
But again, this is just a very odd set of references here. How words have been used, twisted, reused, reinterpreted, redefined, and but you get these references back to pagan moon worship again. I mean, there are links that come back to this, so there's just odd references, don't you think?
It's not that odd when you understand that the text has been modified. But as I told you before, I didn't want to get ahead of myself.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
at the
I'm just
time
bringing
now,
these up. I'm just bringing up these things for my own reference, so I don't forget.
But please remind me in a few slides to go back to this Hanif issue. It's very important, actually. But it will be there. I won't forget it if you remind me.
Now, these terms mutate. I mean, over time, you see them mutate, and I think there are times when Muslims have used the word and said, "Hey, we're that, we're X," and then they discover that X actually paints them in a very bad light and embarrasses them, and then suddenly X becomes Y.
Oh, they modified it.
Yeah. So,
but let me just keep on with this very basic reading of the Quran. So I'm not making a far-fetched hypothesis here. It's only the literal text, and the literal text already told us the Nazarenes are not Christians. They belong to the people of the book, so they are Jews themselves, but they are different from most of the other Jews. There is a distinction between the Jews and the Nazarenes. So we already have something to tread on here. There is something also about the Nazarenes. They are pictured in some verses in a very positive fashion. So one could conceive that they are the friends of the believer, or at least they used to be. If you look at the verse 62, Surah 2, those who believe, those who Judaize, and the Nazarenes, whoever believes in God in the last day and does good, they shall have their reward from their Lord. So they are pictured in a very positive manner as having the good religion. At least they believe. They believe just like the Arab believers believe. And if you look at the verse 69 in Surah 5, surely those who believe, those who Judaize, the Sabians, and the Nazarenes, whoever believes in God, they shall have no fear. So it's kind of the same. It tells us that they share a sort of common religion with the Arab believers. Arab believers and Nazarenes believe supposedly in the same thing, and God is pleased in what they believe, and God will reward them. If you look at this very emblematic verse again in Surah 5, verse 82, certainly we'll find that the most violent of people in enmity to the believers are the Jews and the one who associate, meaning the Christians. Certainly we'll find that the closest of them in affection to the believers are those who say we are Nazarenes because priests and monks and so on. So they are the closest in affection to the believers. So if we really look into it, the Nazarenes are literally described in the Quran as believers. They are good Jews, so they are non-rabbinic Jews. They are opposed to the other Jews. And so the question here, if you follow the logic of my presentation, are the Nazarenes the good community among the people of the book? Seems logical to posit that they could be this good community. And so there would have been very close to the Arab believers a Nazarene community, a Jewish community with them. So this is what the literal Quranic text seems to tell us. And when we look outside of the Quran, I just want to make a little excursus. Let's just look at external sources about this possible Jewish influence on early Islam. We have contemporary accounts of the rise of Islam that shows an influence, and a Jewish influence, and a connection to Jews, or at least to people that were considered Jews or Judeans by the early witnesses, the contemporary witnesses. I already told you about the fact that there was a Judeo-Arab coalition with the Persian during the conquest of Jerusalem in 614. But we have documents, sources, that tells us that there was something Jewish in very early Islam. You know about the Doctrina Jacobi, or Didascali of Jacob.
Yeah.
It's a Greek pamphlet directed against Jews, and it's a Christian pamphlet, and it pictures a discussion between two fictional Jews, Jewish characters, discussing about a prophet who has appeared with the Saracens. So it's almost the first mention to a possible candidate for Muhammad. But when we really understand what's going on in this text, when two Jewish characters, two Jews, discuss about prophecy, they do not discuss about prophecy within Islam. They discuss about prophecy within Judaism. And what is the prophet Jews are waiting for? I'm sure you have the answer, Lloyd.
Just say it again. I was just distracted. I was writing a comment. Just say, what was the question?
It was a rhetorical question. The kind of prophecy, the kind of prophet that the Jews are still waiting for, it's the prophet that will point at the Messiah. According to Judaism, the Messiah should be preceded by a prophet, the new Elijah, who will point at the Messiah, who will say, this is the Messiah. This is the prophet they are waiting for.
That's John the Baptist.
Having those two Jews discussing about prophecy, a prophecy being related to the Saracen movement, tells us that the prophet that has appeared with the Saracen could be a possible candidate for Jewish prophecy. So there is something Jewish about this movement, the Saracen movement, the Arab
Saracen,
movement.
It comes from the destitute of Sarah. Those when Abraham, his wife Sarah, Abraham's wife, cast out Ishmael and Sarah. So they are the ones. I mean, at least that's the name and the story that they took for themselves.
Yeah, the thing here is that Saracen was a common word at the time to refer to Arabs. So at the time, in 640 is the date when the Doctrina Jacobi was written. It refers to events that happened in 634. So in 634, there was already an Arab movement with someone that could be, within this movement, a possible candidate for Jewish prophecy. A possible candidate. But he was not recognized as a Jewish prophet because, as the text says, he is a false prophet. Do prophets come fully armed? We have another very interesting source for showing us a Jewish influence in the early Islam movement. It's the Sebeos Chronicle, or Pseudo-Sebeos, telling us about a man from among the sons of Ishmael, so an Arab, named Muhammad, or most probably because there was no vowels, Mahmet or Mahmet, a merchant. He appeared to them, to the Arab, as a preacher sent by God and taught them about the God of Abraham. He was very knowledgeable and well versed in the history of Moses. All remaining descendants of the children of Israel joined the Arab, forming a large army. So it tells us a bit about Jewish influence within the early Arab movement, the early proto or pre-Islamic movement. There is this very important letter from the Academy of Jerusalem to the diaspora communities in Egypt. You'll find all these sources, for example, in Robert Hoyland's book, Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, where he did a critical study about them. You have them also in Stephen Shoemaker's book, A Prophet Has Appeared, where he also discusses this letter. And this letter tells us when the Arabs came to Jerusalem, so it was the second taking of Jerusalem, so not the one from 614, but the one that occurred around 638. There were men among them from the sons of Israel who showed them the location of the temple. Tells us one thing very important. There were sons of Israel within the Arab movement or the pre-Islamic or early Islamic movement. It also tells us that at the time in 638, Jews came back to Jerusalem. After their 3-year rule over Jerusalem, the Persian put them a bit away and assumed themselves the rule over Jerusalem. And thereafter, around 627, the Byzantines retook Jerusalem, and they expelled all the Jews. There were retaliations, even vengeance against the Jews because of what they had done, because of their rebellion at the time. And Jerusalem, from the Byzantine retaking up to the Arab taking of 638, was forbidden to Jews. This letter tells us that the Jews were allowed to come back to Jerusalem when the Arab took it. And we have another indication in Sebeos, so the same chronicle, or pseudo-Sebeos. I shall also speak about the plots of the rebellious Jews who, after gaining help from the Hagarenes, the Arabs, for a brief while, decided to rebuild the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Finding the spot called the Holy of Holies, they rebuilt it with base and construction as a place for their prayers. So these various contemporary accounts of the rise of Islam tells us something about an influence, a Jewish influence in the early Islamic movement. So it sort of converges with what we see in the Quranic text. This is why it's interesting. The Quranic text tells us about this group of good Jews being sort of allied or very close to the Arab believers, and some contemporary witnesses tell the same thing. Those contemporary accounts also tells us that this early Jewish-Arab alliance dissolved quickly. We know from the Jewish traditions that are, for example, that have been studied by Moshe Gil in his book, A History of Palestine, that the Jews were expelled from Jerusalem by the Arabs themselves around 640, maybe 642. So this alliance didn't last. Something happened, and the Jews were expelled. We also have in the Sebeos an odd story about a dispute, an enmity between the Ishmaelites, so the Arabs, and the Jews. The Ishmaelites being envious of them, so the Jews who rebuilt the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, So the Ishmaelites expelled them from that place, called the same house of prayers their own, then the former built in another spot, and so on. I don't know whether the story is true or not, or accurate, but it's not the issue here. What we can make out of Sebeos Chronicle is that there was some kind of enmity at the time between the Arabs and the Jews. This is something very interesting for our research. If we also look at external sources, we have the Islamic narrative, the Islamic tradition. It also describes a Jewish influence. We have influenced Jewish figures in this narrative, influence in the early Islam movement. Maybe the most influential of all is Waraka bin Naufal. He is described as being a Nazarene, so a Jew, according to the literal Quranic text. A Nazarene who was a cousin of Muhammad's first wife, Khadija. And according to the Islamic narrative, the interpretation of the word Nazarene is supposedly a Christian. But we have already seen in the literal Quranic text that Nazarene cannot mean Christian. He was a Nazarene, a Jewish. And he is also described as having presided or done the wedding between Muhammad and Khadija. So he was sort of a priest. There is a very interesting book about him called the Priest and the Prophet, or the Prophet and the Priest. I don't remember exactly. Written by a Lebanese scholar, Joseph Azi. His Arabic name is Musa Abu al-Hariri. And he has compiled everything he has found within the Islamic tradition about Waraka bin Naufal and the Nazarenes. It's something very, very odd. For example, in Ibn Hisham's Sirah, we find that Waraka bin Naufal followed the religion of Moses before converting to that of Jesus. This means he was a Jew before becoming a Nazarene. So there is something very odd with this Waraka bin Naufal. He was a Jew. He converted to Nazarenism, and he was a mentor to the prophet, according to the Islamic narrative. He was the one who authenticated the early revelation, and he is also said to master Arabic and Hebrew, and being able to translate the sacred Hebrew scriptures into Arabic. So a very influential and odd figure, a very influential Jewish figure and an odd figure within the Islamic narrative. We have also Ka'b al-Ahbar, who is described in the Islamic narrative as being a Jew who had converted to Islam and who was a companion of Umar, supposedly the second caliph, who conquered Jerusalem around 638. And he asked Umar the permission to build an oratory or a synagogue, so a Jewish prayer site, something Jewish, on the Temple Mount after the conquest of Jerusalem. So it's something very, very odd again in the Islamic narrative, because a Jew does not build something on the Temple Mount like this. It doesn't build, I don't know, a convenience store. No. When you build on the Temple Mount within the Jewish culture, you rebuild the temple. So again, something very strange in the Islamic narrative.
Yeah, I want to mention something because I mean, there's a lot to untangle here, but you can do it too. Says in some hadiths, Waraka's full name ends in al-Uzza, and if I recall from reading of the Sirah, that is like his family name, his father's name. So this links to al-Uzza, which takes us back to pagan deities, and it's all very odd. And I'm just coming just so and the Sabians, right? They supposedly originated in Haran, right, which is in Turkey, just over the border from Syria. And they spread to pre-Islamic Arabia. They interacted with the Jews, the Christians, and what are called the Hanifs, right? Not Muslims at the time, but Hanifs. right? The Muslims later, I mean, that appellation later got applied to Muslims. And the odd thing is that the Muslims were familiar with their beliefs, even though these people are clearly not Christians. So just another clue, just another oddity, to keep in mind.
It is connected to this Hanif issue we'll have to address a bit later. A little thing also about Waraka. His name, bin Naufal. Naufal actually means folio or paper. Well, it's not paper because the use of paper. I don't know whether. I think they were already using paper in the 7th century. But you see, his name is sort of a nickname. He's Waraka from the papers. It tells us about his status or his role as a cleric, as someone who was very knowledgeable with the scriptures. So it might have been a kunya, an Arabic nickname, bin Naufal. There is another character who has this name in the Islamic tradition, who is portrayed as a false prophet, an anti-prophet, a concurrent of Muhammad. Also something very, very strange and odd. There is another very odd character, Salman al-Farsi, who is described in the Islamic narrative as being a Persian Jew who would have converted to Christianity. But Christianity, if you have if you understand the Islamic narrative well, Christianity is Nazarenism. So it's not Christianity, actually. It's Nazarenism, so Judaism. He was one of the good Jews. And supposedly he traveled to Syria, joined Muhammad in Mecca or in Medina, I don't know. He belonged, according to this narrative, to the Ahl al-Bayt, the people of the household of Muhammad. But literally, it doesn't mean that. Ahl al-Bayt means people of the temple. So maybe he was connected to the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. And we also know that, according to this narrative, he was influential in the writing of the Quran. Not according to this narrative, but according to a letter that the Caliph Umar II, so in the beginning of the 8th century, wrote to the Byzantine emperor. Or no, a letter that the Byzantine emperor, I think it's Leo III, wrote to Umar II. There is an article from Robert Hoyland about this. And I think the Byzantine Empire is saying that there were some influential character that took part in the writing of the Quran, and he named Salman al-Farsi, who was a Jew and who had an influence then in the early movement. There is also Zayd ibn Thabit. So he was not a Jew, actually, but this supposedly the secretary of Muhammad, according to Muslim tradition, he received a Jewish education in Yathrib, the future Medina. So there is this thing in the Islamic narrative telling us that there were some kind of Jewish influence. And we also find a sort of devotion toward Jerusalem in early Islam. It even had a central role because we know that the original Qibla, according to the Islamic narrative, was directed toward Jerusalem. We also know about traditions about Jerusalem in the Islamic narrative. I think they are derived from Jewish traditions, but they describe Jerusalem as being the navel of the world and also the place of Abraham. The place, there is a sort of connection, according to this tradition, between the rock, which is the top of the Temple Mount, which is the rock on which the dome of the rock would be in the future built. According to this tradition, there is a sort of connection between this rock and God's throne, or even a connection with the rock and the paradise. So there is something in the Islamic tradition about the sanctity of Jerusalem, which is very, very close to what Jewish traditions say also. And
Yeah, interesting to note is that these rocks are always in the presence of water.
yeah,
So there's numerous wells, even inside the dome of the rock. There's numerous wells, present and past, that are known, many of them. And I mean, and also this goes back again to the Kathisma. It goes back to the Jesus being the water of life. You know, you get these ideas. So it's kind of, there's always this link to water.
it goes back also to Jewish prophecies about a clear spring or a clear water that will flow out of the Temple Mount. The Messiah is supposed to do this. The Messiah is supposed, I don't remember the exact reference of the prophecy. I think it's in Elijah, maybe Isaiah, I don't remember exactly. But you know what I mean, Lloyd. I think your very knowledgeable audience knows also. In the Islamic tradition,
Like you
Jerusalem
said,
is also excuse me, Lloyd.
no, it's just like you said, it's very difficult to focus in on one thing because
Yeah,
immediately you find connections to other things. And I keep thinking of other things and I'm like, how does that fit in there, you know?
yeah. But I just wanted to make here a very
Mm,
short excursus because
mm,
our main focus here is on the literal reading of the Quran and about the good Jews within the Quran as being the Nazarenes. And what I just wanted to show here, to highlight, is that there are external sources, so contemporary non-Muslim sources, and also sources within the Islamic narratives that tells us there was something Jewish in early Islam. So the literal reading of the Quran telling us about the Nazarenes being Jews and about a Jewish influence is not far-fetched. It's not an out of the blue hypothesis. It's grounded in the literal text, and it has also echoes in the external sources, and that's very interesting because these sources, most of them are independent from the Quran. Most of them, and even the sources about the Jewish figures, for example, within the Islamic narrative, they have nothing to do with the Quran, with the actual Quran. They are not derived from the Quran. They are independent from the Quran. So there is really something about this Jewish influence. And because of this, we can sort of correct the vision of the early Islam protagonists. So according now to the literal reading of the Quran and not to the Islamic narrative. So we know that the Islamic tradition is wrong about the different categories we already saw. So let's put this big cross. And in its stead, we have uncovered that the people of the book are composed of good Jews and bad Jews. And now we can say that the good Jews are maybe, I think it's the most probable, the Nasara, being the Nazarenes, or I call them also Judeo-Nazarenes, in order to specifically point and refer to the Nazarenes that are described in the Quran. Because as we already saw, the word Nazarene or Natsaraya in Aramaic or Nasara in Arabic has many, many different meanings. And I just want here to pinpoint the Nasara that are described in the Quran. So I use the word Judeo-Nazarenes for them. And we can already understand that there was a sort of alliance between the Arab believers and the Nasara. And together they formed a community. So the first actual community was not about the Arab believers being Muslims in the sense of Islam, but it was a community between the Arab believers and the Nazarenes from the Quran. and beside them there were the Christians, the mushrikun. So here we have a much more precise view of the protagonist of early Islam according to what the Quran literally says. And it clearly contradicts the Islamic interpretation of the Quran. But let us now dive into a bit deeper into the literal text, into the literal reading of the Quran. We already established, thanks to a very basic reading of the Quran, many things. But we will see now that concerning the Nazarenes, the Quran is not to be trusted directly. There are some oddities or maybe incoherencies within the text that needs further investigation. This is why we need an advanced reading of the Quran and not just a basic one. Because the Nazarenes in the text, they are depicted as friends of the believers, as we already saw.
So pause a moment, because words, I have learned over time that words can have very important meanings. You use the words friends, right? And in Islam, friends has a very specific connotation, the awliya. And this refers to the Sufi, right? This specifically refers to the Sufi. Now, let me just go back. Just got a note. Now, for instance, when you look at, so there's a scholar called Catani, I think Leon Catani, I think he could be Italian or French. His feeling is that Muhammad's revelation, I mean, for whatever reason, but based on his research, Muhammad's revelation didn't happen the way that it happened over time with deep reflection, which is reflected in some of the other literature, not the Quran itself. That there was reflection. Muhammad would do meditation. Even Colin from the other Islamic channel, he's covered this as well, right? Which is basically, it seems to take the ideas of Jewish mysticism and applies it to Muhammad. And he does this meditation in the cave, and he comes up with these ideas of Islam over time, slowly and gradually. So Katani puts forward this idea. Now, one has to know, we can just dismiss these things, or one can ask, wait, hold on, is there some kind of merit to it? Is there some kind of value that can be drawn from it if we investigate, right? So, which is something a question that I tend to ask and I investigate. So you talk about the word friends, but friends, what if they mean it in the sense of awliya, Sufi, right?
The thing, remember the quote I gave from Patricia Kroner, telling us, do not try to understand an historical source with later explanations. You will, at first, you need to try to understand the text by itself, or by referring to previous sources. And I'm sure there is something to look forward to with Sufism and so on. But one thing for sure, Sufism did not exist in its form in the early 7th century. It's a much later construction.
But don't forget, there was Merkava mysticism, which seems to be a source that somehow influenced some of these, the Muslim mysticism that followed and eventually culminated as Sufism.
Just look at this verse. If you look at this verse, there is this mention of friends or friendship, but it has the same meaning as ally. In verse 51 in Surah 5, "O you who believe, do not take the Jews and the Nazarenes for friends or for allies." It's almost the same word, I agree, in Arabic, because they are friends of each other, they are allies of each other. This way we understand the deep meaning of the word, just as you put it. And anyhow, I displayed this verse because we saw previously that the Quran seems to portray Nazarenes as friends and closest in affection with the believers, but they are also portrayed as enemies. And this is something very hard to reconcile. How can someone be both a friend and an enemy at the same time? So Nazarene here are supposed to be friends with enemies, with the enemies of the believers, with the unjust people. In this other verse, this verse has two meanings, and it's a very interesting one. So verse 14 in Surah 5, with those who say, we are Nazarenes, we made a covenant. So it's God supposedly speaking here as a rhetorical tactic by the authors of the Quran. So God says, we are Nazarene. Well, I, God, made a covenant with the Nazarenes, but they neglected a portion of what they were reminded of. Therefore, we excited among them enmity and hatred to the day of the resurrection. And thereafter, the narrator, who is not God, goes on, God will inform them of what they did. And so here we have two things. The Quran tells us that there has been a sort of divine alliance with the Nazarenes, and that this divine alliance, this covenant, is no more. It's over. So no more friendship. So we have two very important informations in this verse.
Could this be a reference to the covenant of Moses is past, and we now have the new covenant with Jesus? We have the new covenant, the New Testament.
Actually, if you look at the contextual verses, it's not about the Nazarenes, it's about the Jews and their own covenant with God, according to the preacher's opinion.
Okay.
But let's just look at the text for what it literally says here. Let's not go too deep into the critique. The text tells us that there was an history within Nazarenes. At first, there was a covenant, then they neglected a portion of it, and the covenant was over. So it tells us about an evolution with the Nazarenes. They might have been friends at the time, and then they became enemies, which could explain why they are portrayed as being both friends and enemies within the text. It could also explain why in Surah 9, verse 30, we have something very, very odd about Jews and the Nazarenes. This verse says, and it has raised a lot of controversy. The Jews say Ezra is a son of God, and the Nazarenes say the Messiah is a son of God. That is a saying with their mouth. They imitate the saying of those who covered or denied before them. May God fight them, or are they so deluded? So here we have a verse that seems to indicate that the Nazarenes could be Christians because they seem to believe that the Messiah is the Son of God.
That's weird. Yeah.
But yeah, it's weird. It's weird because it seems to contradict all the other verses and many verses that literally say that the Nazarenes are not Christians.
Could these be later insertions or earlier insertions that got jumbled?
So maybe
two different arguments, two different times, two different people writing it, and they just left them in.
It might be, but we could also look a bit deeper into the meaning of the phrase "the Messiah is the Son of God." But just before that, there is something also very odd with the expression the Jews say Ezra is the son of God, because I don't think we ever found any Jewish reference to Ezra having been a son of God. And besides the Arabic text says Uzair ibn Allah, so Uzair being the son of God. And Uzair is very strange because we don't know who Uzair is. and the Islamic narrative tells us, no, it's not about Uzair, it's Ezra, the Jewish prophet. But I've looked at very early manuscript fragments, Quranic manuscript fragments, and I saw that in some of them, there is no, the diacritic marks tell something different. It's not written Uzair, but Aziz. And Aziz, it's something else. Aziz ibn Allah can be translated as cherished be the Son of God. Aziz means cherished, dear. It has also become a name in Arabic, Aziz.
Yeah, Uzair.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, it's something a bit strange here. It tells us that the Islamic narrative is not very clear on the interpretation of the verse.
I mean, you look at. When you
there
look
might
at
have been textual manipulations here.
No, I mean the Quran is a lot of loose strands, like little threads to untangle. Like if you look at the chapter Yasin, Sin is the Babylonian moon god, right? Sin is the god Al-Makka, the Babylonian moon god, of the Babylonian pantheon, the main god, who was also called Allah, who also was called Hubal, who was the main idol, the biggest idol in the Kaaba at Mecca, supposedly. And then you look at Sin. I mean, you've got the root Sin. You look at terms like Islamic names, like Nuriya, I mean, this is Yahweh. This is a Jewish root. So it's just odd that these things are littered all over Islam.
If I'm following your hint, it would make much more sense if it would be not Yasin but Sin Ya.
Yeah, but they call Yasin. I think it's chapter 50 or something, 52 of the Quran, and they call it
something very strange. Yeah, it's one of the loose strands of the Quran, like you put it. All these surahs that have these strange letters at the beginning. So Alif, Lam, Lim, Yasin, Taha, for example.
The references to Ya I was focusing on here, just specifically the reference to Ya. Which is Yahweh.
People who believe that these references are references to psalms. Alif Lam Mim would mean God, El Lemushahot in Hebrew, God of deliverances, or God is a God of salvation, which is a direct reference to a psalm. And this is an interesting hypothesis. It's one I've put forth in my book. Those letters that in the Islamic narrative, they don't know what it is. They think it's a miracle from God. Only the Islamic God knows about them.
Let me just throw something in here. Just throw something in for a moment, just to go on topic / off topic. Those letters. So the term harf or huruf or ahruf, right, in plural, letter of the alphabet, word. Also a Quranic reading or dialect. So that's fine. So we have ahruf. However, when you look at these definitions, you go into the Encyclopedia of Islam. This is the index volume 13. When you look at these definitions, they're very short. You go to the main definition, which is oddly at the bottom. Usually the main definition of a term is on top, right? So the longest definition, the more powerful one, is here. And notice here, the science of the ahruf, right? Onomatomancy, a magical practice based on occult properties of the letters of the alphabet and of the divine and angelic names which they form. So if you go into the longer definition in the Encyclopedia of Islam, volume 3, this actually starts to talk at length about fire letters, earth letters, water letters, wind letters, and it talks about sun and moon letters, and it talks about these terms being used for incantations. So they are gibberish terms that are used for incantations, and there seems to be more definitions than just that. But this is just something that is really odd.
Yeah, it's the same with me. When I started studying Arabic, I always found it very odd that there is this thing about sun letters and moon letters. if you speak a bit of Arabic, you know, for example, that kaf is a sun letter. You say al kitab, whereas I don't know, nur is a moon letter. You say an nur. You don't say al
Noor is
nur.
moonlight, exactly. It's
And
moonlight. They use
why
Noor
do
as
they
light.
choose those very odd words, moon and sun, which reminds me of paganism? And why is it not taught very simple as as strong letters and weak letters, for example? You make
Because
a liaison, a connection with the weak letters. You say Ashariya, for example, or Asarika. And with the strong letters, such as Kitab, Kaf, you say Al Kitab, Kitab. But no, there is this need to refer to moon and sun and so on. And it really reminds you of what you were saying about these magical practices.
they call it letter
There is
magic.
still something about paganism and magic within Islam.
No, there's a massive. Odon, if you go through the Encyclopedia of Islam and you look at the definitions and descriptions, you would be amazed how much of it refers directly to magic and the occult. It's crazy. And David says this letter magic they have also in Tibetan Buddhism. The letter invokes a deity. And you know, I haven't really dug into this in depth in Islam. I've you know, just dipped my toe on the surface, but there's a couple of weird things in Islam. Just thought I'd mention that. Shall we go much
Yeah,
further, Odon, or
lot
shall
of
we
weird things. I
a
agree.
group
I agree.
presentation? Or shall we
Not just a
continue next
couple.
week? Sorry?
Not just a couple of weird things. I think that's much more than a couple.
Yeah. So shall we continue? It's been 90 minutes. Shall
Yeah,
we
yeah,
continue?
yeah. It's already getting late. About this very strange verse, verse 30 in Surah 9. If you look at the contextual verses, it's also it's happening. This verse relates a story that happens at a very particular time. It happens when the believers have finally, ultimately accessed the Masjid al-Haram. They finally went to the place of the sacred mosque or the forbidden mosque. According to the Islamic narrative, it happened at the very end of Muhammad's life, when he finally went to Mecca. So Mecca was retaken from the pagans, and he accessed the Kaaba, the sacred mosque, and he could establish the Islamic religion there. The literal Quranic reading of the text says something else. It says that the Masjid al-Haram is a temple mount in Jerusalem. There's nothing to do with Mecca. But it's another study for another presentation. If I'm telling this here, I think there is an historical context for this verse that is different than most of the rest of the Quran. It happened at a time when the believers finally, ultimately accessed the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, so around 638. And I think this is the moment when the alliance between the Nazarenes and the Arab broke. And this is why we have this condemnation here. It's intended to exaggerate the Nazarenes' characteristics and to justify their condemnation. But I have something else to say. The Nazarenes say the Messiah is the Son of God. It's not exclusive to Christian, the belief in that the Messiah is the Son of God. Actually, if you look in ancient Judaism, the Messiah they waited for, so before Jesus came, was supposed to be also a son of God, not God himself. They didn't know about this. But he was supposed to be a son of God in ancient Jewish tradition. In rabbinic Judaism, they refused Jesus as the Messiah because he said he was God himself. And because of this, there is this distinction, excuse me, that has been made in rabbinic Judaism. The Messiah cannot be God, and so he cannot be the Son of God because of Jesus. But here, reading that the Nazarene says the Messiah is the Son of God doesn't automatically mean that they were Christians. They could have referred to very ancient Jewish traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But the question remains about the covering.
You can look at very old Jewish traditions going back, and you'll find references to the Trinity.
Yeah, also, even in the first verses of Genesis, it talks about God as being a word, a creator, and as having a spirit. A very
No, but they call him the tri-Godhead or something, the triune. I mean, you find this in the Jewish writings, and a lot of that changed in I think around the year 1000 with around the time of the publishing of the Masoretic text, when the Jews who wrote that, they started to scrub. I mean, literally, some of these references to the triune God were scrubbed from the Jewish literature by whichever group had charged at that point.
You mean they scrubbed something? But another way of putting it is that they covered the sacred scriptures.
Yes, I mean, so yeah, there is that. I mean,
might be the thing that is that the Quran has against them.
yeah.
I want to go a bit faster because maybe I'll be able to wrap everything up before 9, and I think it will be good
for. How many slides have you got?
Some of them, but I can be much faster.
Should we do this next week? I don't want you to rush. I mean, this is an interesting conversation. I'm trying to let you speak, but I also want to comment when you say something interesting. Shall we rather just continue again next week? What do you think? Were you okay with that?
Then
we rush through.
I have no. I think it will be better to have everything in one take, because I have something like maybe 15 to 20 minutes left to present. Let's say we can finish at 9. So about the contradiction about the Nazarenes within the text, so they are depicted as friends and enemies, and to depict them as enemies, we see that we have many verses that conflate the Nazarenes with the Jews. I already talked about it at the time when we were doing the very basic reading of the Quran, but now I want to go a bit deeper into it. It's a bit strange that the Nazarenes should share the same condemnation with the Jews. We have 7 verses that all use the phrase "the Jews and the Nazarene," or "the Jews or the Nazarenes," or "neither the Jews nor the Nazarenes." And we can remark already that it very conveniently includes the Nazarenes within the condemnation of the Jews. So it indicates 2 things: that there might have been a sort of kinship between the Jews and the Nazarenes, but we already know of this from other verses. And it also tells us that there might be something odd about this. It's much too convenient to be completely true, but I will go back to it in
this is a parallel to the Nazarenes and the pagans versus the Nazarenes or the pagans, because they were different, and then they were the same. Mushrikun, it was, remember, the Mushrikun? First,
I remember.
were Christians and Mushrikun, and now and then they're the same. It's very much
thing is, within the Quranic text, it's very hard to identify Nazarenes with Mushrikun within the literal Quranic text.
For sure.
Whereas the literal text seems to identify the Jews and the Nazarenes which doesn't make sense if the Nazarenes are Christians.
None of this makes sense, Odon. That's why we're trying to make sense of it.
You see, within the Quranic text, we have many verses condemning the Jews. So it's a known thing that the Quran doesn't like the Jews for many reasons. And this is why I think it's very convenient for some verses to include also the Nazarenes, because it conflates them with the Jews. And so, because they are like the Jews, they are to be condemned. They have to share the same condemnation. Anyhow, this is how they also are portrayed as enemies. And the purpose for me of this slide was to explain that this contradiction that we find within the Quran about the Nazarene as being both friends and enemies, this contradiction could be explained by a shift in the relationship between the believers and the Nazarenes. I think it's the most logical hypothesis.
Well, we know there was one. There was this unity at one point.
Exactly.
You go back to the Kathisma, where they had Jews, Christians, and Muslims in a church worshiping communally, and then of course that is literally destroyed. But the Muslims take that idea and then go build the Dome of the Rock.
It adds to the external sources I mentioned. I should also mention the Kathisma. You see, it sort of converges with what the external sources and also the Islamic narrative in a bit, but mostly the external sources tell us. They tell us, as we saw earlier, that there was a sort of alliance or community of Jews and Arabs, and at the time the alliance broke. The Jews were expelled by the Arabs from Jerusalem. So there is something converging here. We have the sort of the same thing in the Quranic text, the literal reading of the Quranic text, and in the external sources. And so if we develop this hypothesis of an evolution, a shift in the relationship, we will get to this diagram. This diagram is mostly a synthesis of what I already explained about the protagonists of early Islam. So at the beginning, there were Nasara and Kufar being the people of the book. This is what I already explained. Remember, the people of the book, so the Jews, are composed of good Jews and bad Jews. The Nasara, the Nazarenes, are the good Jews. They form a community, the Ummah, with the Arab Ummah, with the Arab believers. And bad Jews and Christian together, they are the enemies of the believers. This could be, in my opinion, this was the situation at the time of the covenant that is referred to in Surah 5, verse 14. It was the early alliance between the Arab believers and the Nazarene. Thereafter, the covenant was broken, and the Arab believers separated from the Nazarenes. So the enemies of the believers sort of excluded the Nazarenes. The Ummah became sort of uniquely composed with Arab believers, and the enemies of the believers expanded because they included the Nazarenes. And in a third step, much later, there was the standard Islamic narrative's reinterpretation of all of these events and all of their description within the Quranic text, leading to the diagram we already saw during the previous presentation, leading to the vision of the protagonists of early Islam according to the standard Islamic narrative. So the Al-Kitab, the people of the book, being the Muslim plus Christians plus Jews, the mushrikun being pagans and also Christian by extension, and all of them, Christian, Jews, and mushrikun, being the enemies of the believers and being all infidels, kufar. This would have been this is I think a very interesting way of understanding the evolution of the relation between the Arab believers and the Nazarenes. And this was due to various events, and the standard Islamic narrative completely changed the way we look at the Quranic text. It changed the meaning of the words. It added stories, external stories, to justify another story, and the literal reading of the Quran became hidden under a cover of thousands of stories and reinterpretation that sort of prevent Muslims from seeing what is already before their eyes. Because the literal reading of the Quran is not that difficult. It's easy. You just have to look at the text for what it really is. But it's very difficult for someone who has been bred and taught within the Islamic narrative to look at the text with a fresh eye, and a different way than the Islamic way. Another, yeah.
You make me think of something. I just want to mention some. This is linked to my polemic series, which is the Islamic polemic against Saint Paul and the claims of tahrif, or the corruption of the Bible, which generally leans towards they are misinterpreting, and then later on you get this emphasis on no, they have rewritten, they've edited, they've changed the text. First you had misinterpret, and then you had edit, right? But just want to bring up something, because there's a parallel to the story that you're speaking of, these believers, this the people. So I'm not going to go into all the context, but so Paul has a vision that he wants to reveal only to a small group. This is how Paul destroys Christianity, right? This is one of those stories. He sends everyone away except Yaqub, Nastor, and Malkun, okay? Jacob, Nestor, and Malcolm. Now, these are the three branches of Christianity at the time. And of course, Nestor is like, what, 5th century? So Paul is alive in the 400s chatting with Nestor, but okay, we'll just let that go. Malcolm is like 7th century. Paul is 600 years old at that time, but fine, we won't argue with that. And there's a fourth person.
Is supposed to be the brother of Jesus.
I think so.
You present the Jewish Christianity.
Yeah. So it's Jewish, Nestorian, and Melkite Christianity.
So Greek.
Greek, yeah. So this is a complete. I mean, it's a historical joke. The whole Muslim scholarship on this is a complete and utter comedy. But fine. So, and there's a fourth one called the Believer. Now he tries to convince them that God had made himself manifest to them in the person of Jesus, but had then withdrawn from their sight, right? This statement caused discussions and the various Trinitarian doctrines arose. Now remember, there's a lot of previous detail I'm just excluding, because Paul tries to create dissent. He gives a different story to each group to cause division deliberately, right? And he says, you're the main guy for me, here's the truth. And he goes to the other guy, you're the main guy, here's the truth. And he causes this fight. But now the believers stressed that all this was contrary to the true teachings of Jesus. Now, my thinking, before I go on further, is that the story you're telling is kind of a parallel to this, where there's this small core of believers. So this narrative idea, this narrative meme seems to have survived within Islam. So so the believers that believed that all this was contradictory to the true teachings of Jesus. Consequently, he left them and he urged his followers to remain faithful to the only true teaching, that of Jesus. So the Muslims claim that they are the only ones that have retained the true teachings of Jesus, the truth of Jesus. Paul corrupted it and gave all the other groups the wrong teaching, and they have retained this. Each of the four was taken into Paul's confidence. They gathered a group of followers. The believers had the smallest group, or the believer, one believer. Paul urged the other three to fight the believer and his followers. And so they fled to Palestine, where they were taken captive by the Jews. Now remember, these are real stories of the Muslims back in the day, us poor victims. They asked the Jews to leave them alone, since they only wanted to live in caves in hermitages and on mountaintops. This is monks. This is odd because
Mhm.
it's not part of Islam. And to wander about through the countryside, but these are Muslims making these claims about themselves. Their offspring introduced heresies into the religion, except for a small remnant of followers of the
Mhm.
believer who survived among them and stayed loyal to their original doctrine. And the Crusades were fought to stop the Muslims from introducing the truth to Europe. So the Crusades was an effort by the Christian kings to stop the believers' followers from going to Europe and saying, hey, we've got the truth of Christianity, we're going to share it with you. And so
Ah.
the Crusades was started to kill that message. And the believers, I mean, this is the fiction that they write, but this is a real history of Islam. It's an interesting
Mhm.
parallel, don't you think? There's something weird going on here too.
There's something. This idea of a very small group of believers having the right faith. It's the exact same as the one we see in the Quran about the good Jews, the Nazarenes, as being the very tiny group among all of the Jews that have kept the right Judaism. You see, you were talking about this idea of it being instilled in Muslim consciousness. It might come from the Nazarenes. And I have another thing in mind. You were talking about the tariff issue,
Mhm.
so the falsification. If you look at the Quranic text, there's only one verse that could potentially link this accusation of falsification to Christians. This is a verse. I don't remember the reference, but it's a verse that says that talks about the Ahl al Kitab. Ahl al Kitab. It doesn't talk about Christians. It talks about Ahl al Kitab, and this is the only verse that justify the false belief within Islam that the Christian would have falsified their text. And you
Right.
see, when you modify the expression Ahl al Kitab, when you change its meaning,
People of the
as
temple.
it happened within the Islamic narrative, it allowed for a reinterpretation of the verses, and it allowed for a justification of another condemnation toward the Christians. This is why it's
Right.
very important to understand
Yep.
the change of meaning.
Now,
You might think that, yeah, all this stuff about the Ahl al Kitab having been only the Jews, and then the Islamic narrative changed it. Actually, it has a lot of consequences in the Islamic reading of the Quran, such as the condemnation of Christians as having forged their own text, as lying about Jesus, for example.
yeah. Well, Saif Umar, very important
Mhm.
contributor to Islamic scholarship back in the, I think, 8th, 9th century. Some of these believers escaped to the Arabian Peninsula, where 30 of them lived as monks. Then they see the Prophet Muhammad, and then they believe in him, and that's how Islam starts.
Mhm.
Which is really odd, this conflation of monks and Muslims, and it's just a weird story, you know. But this idea of back
This
to
is
your
how the story
point
was
there of
prompted.
these Muslims are the people of the book and they've retained the core of it. That
Mhm.
story continues, that narrative continues. It's part of the psyche or something like that.
You see how we had a presentation about the fabrication of the Islamic narrative. It was fabricated in order to create stories that would fit the new interpretation of the text.
Hmm.
When you interpret the text with this idea that the Ahl al Kitab include Christians, and so Christian must have falsified the text, you
Hmm.
have to justify it by creating stories about Christian not having the right faith, and so on. And everything you just said is a sort of the story you explain. It's another fabrication based on
Yeah.
a previous fabrication that
Yeah.
has been
Actually,
done to justify the fabrications.
let me
This
show a
is
minute
how
of that.
Islam was made.
So these scholars literally write, and you can see Islamic scholarship is an utter joke. It is not to be taken seriously. It's fantasy. Christians follow Islam for 81 years after Jesus goes to heaven, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then a war breaks out between them and the Jews. As a subterfuge, Paul, who had killed many followers of Jesus, claims to be a Christian, goes to the Christians. So he studies the gospel for a year. He leaves for Jerusalem, and he teaches Nestor that Jesus, Mary, and God were the three members of the Trinity. Nestor lived 400 years after Paul, but okay. And he leaves Nestor as his main guy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then he goes on. Then he goes to the land of the Romans. I wonder, it must be Iceland. Iceland, land of the Romans. No. Timbuktu, that's where the Romans were. Where he taught a man called Jacob that Jesus was not a man, but had become a man, that he had no body, but became a body, and that he was the Son of God. Then he converted a man called Malchon, whom he taught that Jesus was and is God. Then Paul kills himself as a sacrifice to Jesus. Each of the three disciples begin to call upon their fellow men to adopt their contradictory doctrines, and this is how the three Christian sects begin. I mean, it's just the but
I,
this was a big thing back in the day. You see, we forget this
mm-hmm.
now, but this is what Muslims were teaching back then.
Mm-hmm. This is a very, you say it's a fantasy, I agree, but it's very interesting to look into it in order to understand the process. How
Yeah.
and why was it fabricated?
Hmm.
It
I just thought
tells
it
us
gives us clues.
a lot of things about Islam. Islam is something, I already told you this, it's much more than the Quran. It's this whole universe, a sort of metaverse, parallel that parallels the Quran, and that gives a completely different explanation. But the thing is, the Quran still exists, and we can still have a literal reading of it. And its literal reading leads us to understand that the standard Islamic narrative is completely wrong. It is a complete fabrication. And for example, if I go on with my presentation, I have just two more slides, at least actually one slide and then the conclusion. If we take this this timeline, that was the time of the covenant, then the covenant has been was broken, and then there was the standard Islamic narratives reinterpretation. Let's just look at it with this timeline in mind, and just let's look at the verses that talks about the Nazarenes, and it will completely explain the contradiction. And there we might address also the Hanif issue. You see, at the time of the covenant, there was the sort of the covenant was explained in the Quranic text as being a divine covenant, a divine alliance. So it was something very strong, which explains why we have verses praising the Nazarenes, the one we already saw. They shall have their reward from their Lord. They shall have no fear. They are the closest in affection. And this verse 17 in Surah 22, that is not very, it's not very praiseful, but it's almost the same as the two previous one. Thereafter, when the covenant was broken, starting from the end of the year 630, in my opinion, the Nazarenes were condemned with the Jews. And I think the 7 verses we already saw with the mentions the Jews and the Nazarenes, or the Jews or the Nazarenes, or neither Jew nor Nazarenes, I think all these verses were interpolated with the mention of the Nazarenes. These 7 verses here. Because if we look in some of these verses, in their context, the condemnation doesn't make sense at all. For example, it only talks about Jew, about, for example, the history of Moses' people, and it brings a condemnation, including the Nazarenes, which makes absolutely no sense if you take it with the contextual verses. I also think that there were 2 other interpolations that were a bit more elaborated, that were added. The one in Surah 113, Surah 2, excuse me, verse 113, the Jews say the Nazarene rely on nothing. And the Nazarenes say the Jews rely on nothing while they recite the book. Here also, if we look at the context, it's all about the Jews. It has nothing to do with the Nazarenes. And it very much looks like an interpolation. But the thing is, it's the same with the covenant. I used it a lot. In Surah 5, verse 14, there is a mention of the covenant having been made with the Nazarenes. If you look at the contextual verses, it talks about the covenant having been made only with the Jews from the time of Moses and so on. But does it mean that a covenant with the Nazarene is impossible? I think, and that's also very interesting, when the interpolation were made, they were made in order to appear legit.
Mm-hmm.
They had to add a sort of in the basic interpretation, they had to look right. So it seemed when the Arabs felt the need to condemn the Nazarenes, for them it seems natural to condemn them as Jews because they were also Jews. They felt they had been tricked by the Nazarenes, that the plan to trigger the apocalypse by rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, they felt that this plan had failed. And because of this, they sidelined the Nazarenes. I think they also killed their leaders. And they justify it by saying they're as vile as the Jews. They are their cousins, after all. They belong to the people of the book. And so there is a sort of varnish of legitimacy to the accusation. They could not have forged accusation out of the blue without any link to the real thing, the reality. And when we look at the story of the covenant, I don't think it means there never was any covenant with the Nazarenes. The one who forged this verse, the one who interpolated with those who say we are Nazarene, we made a covenant, he did not invent this idea of a covenant. He wrote it there to condemn the Nazarenes and to conflate the condemnation with that of the Jews. But he could not have invented a false covenant. Otherwise, his interpolation would have meant nothing. It would not have had any meaning for his contemporaries. You see, those interpolations are false, of course, but they had to have a sort of right feel to it.
Yeah, no, it had to be mimic the facts or the truth.
So even though they are interpolation, we can still learn some things thanks to them about the Nazarenes. But because they are interpolation, they also led to discrepancies and incoherencies. You see, the verses praising the Nazarenes are much more coherent than the verses condemning the Nazarenes with the Jews. And that's the thing with all the textual manipulation of the Quran. They lead to incoherencies and discrepancies. For example, if you add "and the Nazarenes" to the verse, "Oh, you don't take the Jews for allies, for friends, allies, don't take them for friends." Excuse me. Oh, you who believe. Okay, I have the verse here. Do not take the Jews for friends. They are friends of each other. and you add
Yeah.
and the Nazarenes. Or you believe, do not take the Jews or the Nazarenes for friends, they are friends of each other. It changes the meaning of the verse. Okay, it still condemns the Jews, it also condemns the Nazarenes, but it says something that is incoherent. And we already looked at it. It says that, for example, that it says that the Jews and the Nazarenes are friends, and they were never friends. And the Islamic reading of the word Nazarene as Christian makes even less sense. And you see, by mingling with the text, you had incoherencies over incoherencies. You create
Mhm.
layers of discrepancies, and in the end, it tells us that it's a very strong clue to tell us that the text has been interpolated, that the text has been tampered with. And it's, I think, the same with the Hanif stories. You see here, I reference verse 3, verse 67 in Surah 3, which tells us that Ibrahim was neither a Jew nor a Nazarene. He was a true Hanif. And there are many other verses like this. If you subtract the Nazarene from the verse becomes, and I think it was its original version, Abraham was not a Jew, he was a Hanif, and he was not one of the associators. And you see then that this original version is much more simple, much more easy to understand. It's a condemnation from a Nazarene perspective of the belief that the Jews are the descendants of the spiritual descendants, the rightful descendants of Abraham. It tells, no, 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 no. You are not the rightful descendants of Abraham because Abraham was not a Jew. He was a Hanif. He had the true faith. Like us, the Nazarenes, we are Hanif. And I think this answers your questions and the issue you were pointing at, the Hanif issue you were pointing at. What do you think of this, Lloyd?
No, it makes sense. I mean, I think it's a fairly logical conclusion to draw.
It's
And
logical. It's logical, yeah. As for verse 930, we already spoke about it. And if I just want to finish, in order to finish this, let's go to the Islamic reinterpretation of the text that happened from the 8th century, but the fabrication of the Islamic narrative is a process that never ended. It's still going on now. So for centuries, they invented stories about Muhammad, about the revelation, the circumstances of the revelation, and it led to the fabrication of an apparently coherent Islamic narrative that reinterprets the text, and it led to the erasure of the memory of the Nazarenes. When you think about it, it's something amazing. Their memory was erased, and even their own name was taken from them. Because Nasara in the Islamic narrative has become Christian or equivalent to Christians. And the very memory of this group has vanished. There are remnants, ideas, like the one you spoke about, the idea of a very small group having the right faith against all the others. But that's the thing with the Islamic narrative. It covered it covered the actual stories, and it redefined everything. It redefined all the protagonists of early Islam and so on, and it invented stories, a false pagan background, and so on. And this led to a huge, widespread, a huge increase in incoherencies. You see, we have a first layer of incoherences due to textual manipulation, interpolations, for example, that
No, I
happened
remember I said it's
in the 7th
projection.
century.
Whatever they've done, they projected that on the others. I said last week it's projection. What they were doing is what
You
they
have to
accused the others
already
of.
have in mind this thing. They are already there. The faults, the sins they point in others. They already have them in them, or otherwise they would not be able to fathom them.
Yeah.
And
So
this is a thing that is very important. This huge amount of incoherencies and discrepancies, because there are clues that leads us to understand how the narrative was fabricated, and it helps us go back to the original text and the actual story. And this is what I did to write my book. I work backwards. I sort
right.
of reverse engineered the Islamic narrative, or at least its fabrication. All right, this leads to my conclusion, which is just a synthesis of what we saw. From the literal reading of the Quran, we get to understand that it addresses a Jewish polemic between two currents of Judaism: Judeo-Nazarenism, which is a forgotten, vanished, disappeared Jewish group, and Rabbinism, as in Talmudic Judaism, where the Arabs listening to the preaching are drawn in. The Quran references Judeo-Nazarenism, calling its member Nazarenes, excuse me, and they are described as being the very few good Jews opposed to all the other bad Jews, described as being kufar, coverers, or rabbinic Jews. They are the upstanding community, the righteous community among the Jews. They recognize Jesus as the Messiah, but not his divinity, therefore opposing Christians. They hold the Torah and the Gospel sacred. They still have their unaltered text in their possession. They have the true faith. They recite the verses of God. They command right, forbid wrong. They believe in God and in the last day. They
When they
established
say command
covenant.
right and forbid wrong, I mean, is that the Islamic practice or their own practice?
It became an Islamic practice, but it was the own way of, it was the Nazarene way before Islam. Before Islam, the Nazarenes already developed this way of thinking out of Judaism. It's very close to the Second Temple Judaism. It's very, very close to it. The difference with the Nazarene is that I think is that they developed a global political messianism that did not exist in the time of the Second Temple Judaism, before the destruction of the temple. And so the Jewish Christian faith evolved around this new idea of messianism. Anyhow, we have established the existence of this Nazarene. It's very important. Remember, in our introduction, I was referring to studies about the Jewish Christian groups in the late antiquity, explaining that we lose trace of any such group around the 4th, 5th, 6th century. But no scholar, apart from Edouard Marie Galès, has used the Quran as an historical source yet. And thanks to the literal reading of the Quran, we can now justify the existence of Nazarenes in the 7th century. They are described by the Quran. Their very existence is justified by the Quran without reliance on external sources. That's very interesting, because external sources, independently from the Quran, they seem to corroborate this, as we saw. So one could, from the starting point of the existence of Nazarenes, thanks to the literal reading of the Quran, one could hypothesize that these Nazarenes, these Quranic Nazarenes, share similarities with those mentioned in earlier ancient texts. And this is what Édouard Marie-Galès did in his thesis, Le Messie et son prophète. And this will be my conclusion. Over to you, Lloyd.
It makes sense. I mean, if you logically stack up, as you said, they recognize Jesus as the Messiah. They do this, they do that. There's a consistency there. There's a story to be taken out of it, even though the Quran tries to be vague. And this matches up with various stories. I mean, as nonsense and corrupt as they may be, but it does line up with certain facts that we can reference within the other Islamic texts, and then also from history.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, so there's other evidence that sort of aligns with this. There seems to be certain cultural threads that align with this as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I mean, they've covered the truth. Certainly, they've confused the heck out of it, but you can still piece together certain facts. You can say, look, this seems reasonable, that seems reasonable. So yeah, conclusions can be drawn.
One of this, an element of this conclusion would be to state that the Nazarenes had a crucial influence on early Islam, obviously, or at least they had a crucial influence on the faction that took Jerusalem. Because this literal reading of the Quran only tells us about the conquest, the project of conquering Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, and so on. It doesn't tell us about the conquest of Egypt or Syria or Mesopotamia. So we can only assume an influence on the faction that took Jerusalem. But we can also assume that they had somehow an influence and a sort of part in the writing of the Quran, since they are mentioned in the Quran. And this leads to the question, what part did they play in the writing of the Quran? And so what is the Quran? Which is a matter for many other presentation. And it also reminds me that we promised your audience a presentation on the Jerusalem thesis, which is, in my opinion,
the thing as well, though, before we go to the next one.
Yeah. So there is we have uncovered a lot with this reading, the literal reading of the Quran about the Jews and Nazarene, and what we are doing also on the Mushrikun. But there is still a lot to say about many things in Islam, about the Quran, about Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem, and so on. It's all in my book, but I'm sure we will have other presentation on all these matters.
Yeah, no, very interesting. But it also links up. I mean, it matches with other things that can be added to it to make a more coherent story. And yeah, all very interesting. So yeah, we can call it a night. Then I can run off and go do that thing called eating, which I haven't had a chance to do so yet.
It's been a bit dense.
Yeah, no, it is. But I get it. Yeah, so guys, thanks so very much, and thank you, Odon, for that. These are really interesting, and it makes good sense. It does make good sense, and it's good that we put it all out there. And it does. I mean, it seems to be fairly sound conclusions based on good evidence. And at least it's not based on conspiracy theories and the secret powerful I don't know, Exelarch that came along and he and his okay, I've had enough of those.
We can talk about this, the Exelarchs and so on. But the thing is, are we walking on solid ground? Are we treading on solid ground?
Oh, fair enough. And I mean, fair enough. Yeah, exactly.
Here, with this literal reading of the Quran, we have, like I told, we don't have much in terms of evidence for early Islam, but here we have something.
Yeah.
And we have to take it into account, and it can be used to to have a sort of critique of everything else.
Mm.
And
No,
it's
we know there
not,
was something. I mean, we know that all of these things, all the things that the Quran hints at, we can find external sources that corroborate it or lend credence to it or flesh it out. So, yeah, we can look more at that. I mean, I threw in some things that I thought were interesting because to me, these all start to connect. So
Mhm.
there's lots of influences here, some crazy influences from all over the map. And but yeah, let's discuss that next week. So yeah, so guys, everyone says great presentation and very informative. And thanks Odon and Lloyd. What a wonderful analysis, Odon. Awesome research. Bravo.
Oh,
So guys, thank you very much. I do appreciate you hanging around. Thank
thanks.
you. Please do like it if you like it.
Thanks.
Share it. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this content, if you like these kinds of discussions. And yeah, thanks, guys, for everything. And we shall see you guys in a couple of days. So
All
take care,
right.
everyone. Thanks,
Bye
Odon.
bye.